Hello, my name is Dr. Spencer Jones. I'm a senior lecturer in Armed Forces and War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton in the United Kingdom. I also work for the British Army as I am the regimental historian of the Royal Artillery Regiment. And my topic today is one that is very close to my heart. It's about Winston Churchill, and specifically a moment in Winston Churchill's life when the fate not merely of Britain, not merely of Europe, but the entire world by the slenderest of threads. I have a personal connection to this period. My family served during the Second World War on both sides, both maternal and paternal sides. And my maternal grandfather actually chose my name, Spencer, which was Winston Churchill's middle name, in tribute to, of course, Britain's great wartime leader. In later years, Winston Churchill was asked what his favourite year of his life had been. And of course, he'd led an immensely varied life. He had a simple answer. It was 1940, over and over again. But that was a retrospective view. For in 1940, Britain and Churchill himself faced a darkest hour, the like of which the world had never seen before. Standing in front of the Nazi torrent that was sweeping over Europe, the British Isles were, for a time, all that stood between Hitler and world domination. And it was in this moment that Churchill stepped forward from the shadows to take command of Britain during the nation's darkest hour. But to understand that darkest hour, we actually have to step back some years to understand how we had reached this point. The origins of the darkest hour lay in the 1930s, and specifically with the British government's policy of appeasement. Appeasement now, especially in British political circles, it's something of a dirty word. It's a slur that you would use against a political opponent. But in the 1930s, appeasement was the stated policy of the British government. And it was considered to have very much the moral high ground in dealing with the rising threat of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Appeasement's origins lay way back in the 1920s, but they became a more prominent and more stated government policy from 1936 onwards. And though he was not the sole architect, perhaps the archetypal appeaser was the man on the left of this photo. That's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, meeting Hitler at the Munich conference in September 1938. From 1936 onwards, Chamberlain, as Prime Minister of Britain, stated aim was to do anything to avoid a confrontation, a military confrontation, with Hitler's Germany. And he did this for two reasons. First was an acknowledgement of British and indeed French military weakness. There was a real fear that the Allies simply could not fight Nazi Germany. The second was a naive and ultimately misguided belief that many of Hitler's grievances were perhaps reasonable and could be accommodated in a Europe that was reshaping itself in the aftermath of the First World War. In essence, appeasement believed that at some point, Hitler would have had all that he wanted from Europe, and he would join the general mood of Europe, which was moving towards cooperation and peace. And appeasement was built on this idea. Of course, as we know, appeasement failed. The more that one fed Hitler, the hungrier he became. Chamberlain, though, took a long time to realize this error. He believed almost until the very last moments when war broke out in September 1939 that Hitler could be appeased, that his desire for territorial expansion could be satisfied. And it was the stated government policy of Britain throughout the 1930s. There was very little opposition to it. In fact, the only significant opposition politician who argued against it was this man, Winston Spencer Churchill, in a very evocative shot from the early 1930s. Churchill was actually a member of the government. He was a member of the Conservative government. He'd been a member of the Conservative Party since the early 1920s. But by 1929, he was becoming out of favour with the party. And the 1930s were, as Churchill described them, his own wilderness years. Of course, a reference to Jesus' sufferings in the wilderness. A variety of things were going wrong for Winston Churchill in this period. His children were causing public scandal and private anguish, especially his eldest son, Randolph, and his eldest daughter, Sarah. Churchill was in quite serious financial problems and was having to write more and more to keep the wolves from the door. There were certain marital problems between him and his beloved wife, Clementine. And crucially, Churchill was off message with the rest of the government. Churchill picked three major political battles in the 1930s. Two of them were wrong, one of them was all too correct. The two he picked that were wrong were opposing British reforms designed to guide India towards independence and backing King Edward during the abdication crisis of the mid-1930s. Both of these calls Churchill got wrong. But one which he got correct was his devoted opposition to appeasement. As early as 1931, Churchill had correctly identified the growing threat of Nazi Germany. He had a personal aversion to Hitler, even though the two men had never met. And like many other British politicians, Churchill understood that Hitler was not merely another European statesman, but was in fact an extraordinarily dangerous element, a revolutionary element in Europe that could not be dealt with in the old-fashioned political ways. Instead, Hitler had to be opposed, and ultimately he would have to be dethroned and perhaps even destroyed. But this message found limited interest in the British government of the 1930s. Churchill was off message. His previous errors in the First World War and indeed in the 1920s tarnished his reputation. And indeed, by 1939, the Conservative Party was mounting a sophisticated campaign to deselect him, that is, remove him from the Conservative Party, which would have ended Winston Churchill's political career for good. But he was not completely without allies, but particularly as the threat of Nazi Germany grew in the later 30s. Churchill's outspoken opposition to appeasement and his detestation of Adolf Hitler began to draw allies to him, military officers, younger politicians, and crucially, the British public, who inclined towards his views, especially from 1938 onwards, as it became clear that Hitler would never be satisfied until Europe effectively lay beneath his army's jackboots. But nevertheless, on the eve of war, Churchill was in grave danger. Financially, he was facing ruin. He was on the brink of being deselected from his party, and had it not been for the outbreak of war in that very month, September 1939, history may have been very different. But it was not to be. In fact, in 1939, Chamberlain finally had the scales lifted from his eyes. The Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, in clear violation of the Munich Treaty of September 1938, changed Chamberlain's opinion on Hitler. He realized now that Hitler could not be dealt with in the old-fashioned way. And although he came to this realization terribly late, he nevertheless came to it. And at the outbreak of war in September 1939, he immediately recalled Winston Churchill to the government, citing Winston Churchill's plentiful military experience gained in the First World War, his statesman-like qualities, and of course, crucially, his public support. This was a man who had opposed Nazism from the very, very beginning. Chamberlain and Churchill had been the bitterest of political enemies in the 1930s, but at the outbreak of war, they were able to forge a friendship. Even though they were very different individuals, Chamberlain, comparatively sober, relatively quiet, fussy and pedantic, but also possessed a very sharp mind, compared to Churchill, gregarious, a lover of food and drink, and great company at the dinner table. But nevertheless, they forged a friendship, indeed around the dinner table, and would become very, very close as the months of war dragged on. And this would become important later. Churchill's ability to turn former enemies into close allies was one of his greatest political strengths, and he would have need of his ally Chamberlain in the months to come. The initial months of war, though, were marked, at least in the West, with inaction rather than action. While Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia crushed Poland and dismembered it between their respective empires, in the West, Britain and France did very little. And this period became known as the phony war, a term coined by an American journalist who saw precious little action in Britain and France. And indeed, it almost felt as if the nations were not at war at all. Apart from fighting at sea, very little happened. The British and French launched no offensives against Germany, and Germany simply mustered its forces ready for an invasion in 1940. And many in Britain actually thought that Hitler had made an error in being drawn into war at this stage. And this cartoon captures something of this. It's from September 1939, and it's showing Hitler here. He's surrounded by his apparatchiks, his generals, his brown shirts, the Gestapo, and of course they're all demanding things, and it suggests that Hitler is overwhelmed by the pressures of war and he simply can't manage it. And Neville Chamberlain believed this too. And in early April 1940, he gave a speech in which he used a phrase that would haunt him. He claimed that Hitler had, and I quote, missed the bus. He'd missed his opportunity to win the war. This speech was widely reported, it was widely cited, but it would come back to haunt Chamberlain in just a matter of weeks, because Hitler had not missed the bus. Instead, he had simply been biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And that opportunity emerged on the 9th of April, 1940, when the Germans launched a simultaneous invasion of two neutral nations, Denmark and Norway. Denmark shared a land border with Germany and was easily overrun. Norway was attacked by land and sea. Naval forces moving into the ports, as you can see on this map. German parachute forces landing directly into Oslo airport to seize the capital city and making other landings. The Allies had actually planned to enter Norway before the German invasion. Indeed, Churchill had been heavily involved in this planning, but the planning had been haphazard, it had been disorganized. And the Allied response to the German invasion of Norway was chaotic and quite simply a fiasco. British, French, and even Polish troops were frequently landed in the wrong place. They lacked air cover, their orders were unclear, and exactly what the Allied Expeditionary Force was trying to do in Norway was never entirely certain. The Germans moved with speed and ruthless aggression, and the Allies' response seemed bumbling and haphazard. The ease with which Germany crushed Denmark and Norway in a matter of weeks, in Denmark's case, in a single day, sent a spasm of fear through Western Europe. It was clear that Hitler had not missed the bus. If anything, he was driving a bus through the Allied defences. And the shambolic Allied response to the invasion of Norway and this crushing defeat for free Europe sent shockwaves through the British political establishment. And it led to one of the most remarkable political confrontations in the history of the Houses of Parliament. And we have a rare photograph of it here. This was actually taken with a spy camera, which explains to you why it's such poor quality. This is Chamberlain himself addressing the House of Commons in the so-called Norway Debate. He was called upon to explain why the British response to the German invasion had been such a disaster. It took place across 2 days, the 7th and the 8th of May, 1940. Here you can actually see Chamberlain standing up at the dispatch box. He's addressing the House. And here, this bald chap here, that's Winston Churchill. Remember, he's a member of Chamberlain's government. This photo was illegal. Cameras were not permitted in the Houses of Parliament, but such was the tempestuous mood in Parliament that day that one member of Parliament felt obliged to take a sneaky photograph with a spy camera, much reproduced since. This debate was rowdy. Members of Parliament were banging on tables, they were shouting, they were throwing pieces of paper, and above all else, the opposition sat opposite to Chamberlain, taunted him with his words, "Hitler has missed the bus." It was clear that Hitler had not. Chamberlain fought back, but he was never a great orator. It was never his strength. And by May 1940, although he didn't know it yet, he was seriously ill with what would ultimately become terminal cancer, and his strength was failing him. The rest of the government spoke in Chamberlain's defence, including Churchill himself, but the opposition was not satisfied. The war was clearly not being conducted properly, and they called for a vote of confidence. A vote of confidence is where the entire House of Parliament will cast a yes or no vote in favour of the Prime Minister. Chamberlain actually won that vote. 281 members of Parliament voted yes, 200 voted no. And by rights, Chamberlain could have stayed as Prime Minister. He'd won the vote. But the revelation that almost half the House of Parliament actually opposed his government and did not believe in him was a terrible blow to Chamberlain. And Chamberlain was capable of self-reflection. He knew his health was failing, even if he didn't know exactly what was wrong with it just yet. And he knew that his appeasement policy had failed. He, on some level, knew he was not the right man to lead Britain through a major war. And so he made a decision in the aftermath of the vote that he would step down as Prime Minister. He had the right to nominate a successor, and he had two candidates in mind. His first candidate was the man in the centre of your screen in the hat. That's Lord Halifax. Lord Halifax had been Chamberlain's foreign secretary during the years of appeasement. Chamberlain and Halifax were close personal friends. They had formed a very effective political working relationship throughout the 1930s. Halifax was an appeaser. He, as a consummate diplomat, always rejected the idea of going to war, indeed generating a confrontation with Germany. And he was described as a man who had never met a sharp-edged problem that he could not reduce to a soft-edged one. A master of compromise, a masterful aristocratic diplomat. Standing some 6'5" tall, even though he had a speech impediment, a lisp, and had been born without a left hand, he carried himself superbly and was the epitome of what an English diplomat might look like. He was also extremely popular with the Conservative Party, where indeed he was something of a grandee. Chamberlain, on the 9th of May, asked Halifax if Halifax was willing to become Prime Minister. Halifax gave an ambiguous answer. And then he returned home, where we know from his own diary that he'd worried so much about becoming Prime Minister that he gave himself a psychosomatic illness, a stomachache, and was unable to sleep that night. The following day, on the 10th of May, Chamberlain summoned not only Halifax, but Winston Churchill, pictured on the right, to a special meeting to determine who the new Prime Minister would be. Exactly what happened at this meeting remains somewhat mysterious because minutes were not properly kept for it. We have contrasting accounts. According to one account, Chamberlain offered the Prime Ministership once more to Lord Halifax. Lord Halifax then gave an ambiguous answer, at which point Chamberlain either offered it to Churchill or Churchill stepped in and asked for it himself. What we know about Winston Churchill, a man of action, a man of adventure, I think the latter's rather more likely, that Churchill stepped in when he saw Halifax's hesitation. Chamberlain, realising that Halifax did not really want to be Prime Minister, despite his qualifications for the role, a vastly experienced politician, hugely popular with the Conservative Party, popular with the King too, Chamberlain recognised that although Halifax was his first choice, Churchill was likely to be the more dynamic wartime leader, and clearly Churchill wanted the role. Halifax was willing to accept Churchill as Prime Minister, as was Chamberlain. And so on the 10th of May, it was agreed that Winston Spencer Churchill, 65 years old, the ultimate political adventurer, would become Britain's Prime Minister in its hour of need. And indeed, it was an hour of need. Churchill himself recognised this when he confessed to his bodyguard on the 10th of May, "I hope it is not too late. I fear that it is," because the war was about to burst over Western Europe. But Churchill and Chamberlain, and indeed Halifax, were going to have to form a working government. And this led to the formation of an uneasy alliance. It's a great picture here of Churchill and Halifax. And these two men were polar opposites. You can see by their physiques in this photograph. More than that, their personality was radically different. If we can summarise their differences, Churchill was a man who wanted to bend circumstances to his will, whereas Halifax was a man who would bend his own will to fit circumstances. Churchill was a ball of energy, dynamic, explosive, a superb orator, a man who was, despite his advancing years, could walk extremely quickly, could indeed overwhelm some of his enemies, and indeed sometimes his allies, with his bursts of ideas. A true fireball. Contrastingly, Halifax was as cold as ice, a consummate diplomat, lacking a sense of humour, understanding a great deal about how the corridors of power worked, and a man who sought compromises rather than trying to push action forward. Crucially, too, these men had been political enemies from the early 1930s onwards. They clashed over India and they clashed over appeasement. Halifax had actually abandoned the idea of appeasement a little sooner than Chamberlain. But Halifax also had a very strange view of the Nazi Party and some of its apparatchiks. He described Goering as frankly attractive and made a very strange comment to the German ambassador in the late 1930s about how much he wished to see Adolf Hitler have a parade in London. We don't fully know Halifax's views on Nazism because after the war, Halifax very carefully edited his own paperwork. And so the archival record we have of his correspondence and his diary is rather limited. But what we know from some of his contemporaries is that Halifax's views on Nazism were certainly ambiguous. He was not necessarily pro-Nazi, but he was certainly not anti-Nazi in the way that Churchill was. So you had contrasting personalities, fire, Churchill, and ice. They were going to have to find a way to work together if the government was to succeed. The time pressure was mounting too. The government had to be assembled very, very quickly. It was just a 5-man cabinet in 1940, Churchill at its head, and a combination of Conservative politicians and Labour politicians. We have Lord Halifax, of course, Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister, remember now a friend of Winston Churchill, and two prominent Labour politicians, the main opposition party in Britain, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood. Attlee and Greenwood were anti-appeasement and ultimately they were certainly anti-Nazi, but they were very politically inexperienced. They had no government experience, and the Labour Party at this time was actually comparatively small, and so the voice that they had in the War Cabinet was relatively minor. The key then would actually be how Churchill interacted with Halifax and Chamberlain. One thing that's interesting about this War Cabinet is that this is a true team of rivals Every single one of these politicians had been a rival of Churchill's in the 1930s, but he'd assembled this war cabinet, bringing together what he thought were the brightest, best, and most important figures who would guide British war policy. And here, Churchill's ability to turn former enemies into close friends will become very important. The war cabinet had precious little time to plan its next move. Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May, and he organised his war cabinet on the same day. But on that same day, Adolf Hitler unleashed his Blitzkrieg on Western Europe. The long-awaited German assault had begun, and the phony war was well and truly over. German panzer columns crashed into the neutral Netherlands and Belgium, the Netherlands indefensible and quickly overwhelmed, Belgium fighting hard to try and hold off the German invasion, and meanwhile the French and the British moving to oppose the long-awaited German assault. But the British and French had made a fatal error in their plans. They assumed that the Germans would rerun the invasion plan of 1914, which had begun the First World War. That invasion plan had crashed through Belgium here. And so the British and French planned to move their main forces to fight the Germans on the River Dyle in the middle of this country and stop the advance there. But the Germans were not planning to repeat 1914. They had a new plan. Instead of throwing their main force into Belgium, they would sweep through the Ardennes forest, considered impassable by British and French military intelligence, too heavily wooded. But the Germans pushed panzer and mechanized columns through this forest, racing around the main body of British, French, and Belgian armies here, crashing through weak defenses and racing to the coast. The entire British army, and that is the line here, became encircled in a matter of weeks. And this, ladies and gentlemen, was a cataclysmic shock to the British and the French, who had anticipated a long, grinding war, just as the First World War had been, not a rapid blitzkrieg, the like of which had never been seen before. The speed of the German breakthrough was immense. The invasion began on the 10th of May, and by the 26th of May, the Germans had blocked off the Channel coast, encircling British, French, and Belgian armies in an enormous pocket here. The French were in agony, being overwhelmed from all directions. Their air force struck from the air, their armies driven pell-mell back before the overwhelming German force. And the British army was now trapped in Belgium. It had to fall back to the Channel ports, but Calais very quickly fell into German hands, despite a last-ditch British defence to try and hold it open. The British retreated towards the port of Dunkirk, where it was hoped that somehow, some way, the retreating army could be saved before this pocket closed and the British army was annihilated completely. They could expect no help from the Belgians, who were forced to surrender later in May, and no help from the French, who were separated, of course, by this great panzer breakthrough, what Winston Churchill called the alligator snout that had ripped through the country. The French were trapped here, British and French forces unable to reach them. All that was left was to attempt to escape. And this led to Operation Dynamo, better known as the Dunkirk Evacuation. British, French, and indeed Belgian troops congregated on this small French port, desperately seeking sea lift that could take them back to the United Kingdom. The operation began on the 26th of May. It would run until the 4th of June. Churchill hoped that maybe 45,000 British soldiers could be lifted from those beaches, but there was some 350,000 troops congregated in this region. Furthermore, even if those troops were rescued, they would be shorn of all their heavy equipment, their tanks, their artillery, their anti-tank guns. They would have to be abandoned on the beach. And furthermore, the Germans were closing in, tightening the ring around Dunkirk, hitting it with artillery, and carrying out relentless air attacks on the evacuating ships. And this is a famous painting from Britain showing the Dunkirk beaches under attack, with the town itself wreathed in smoke and flames as it was hit repeatedly with German bombs and artillery. This was the greatest crisis the British Army had ever faced. To give you some idea of the scale, almost the entire British Army was trapped around Dunkirk. In Britain itself, the only fighting formation which had its full quota of equipment was a Canadian division of about 12,000 men. There were troops training in Britain, but they lacked equipment, they lacked modern weaponry. So great was the crisis that museum pieces were taken out of their museums and given to the troops, just in case they were required. So if you've ever been to the Imperial War Museum in the United Kingdom and you've seen the famous Neri gun, a 13-pounder from 1914, First World War, that gun was taken out of the museum, was repurposed, because that was all the weaponry that Britain had Remember, everything's being abandoned at Dunkirk. This is a crisis of monumental proportions. And if the army is lost here, there's nothing left that can replace it in time. And there seemed to be precious little left to stop a German invasion. To give you an idea about how desperate the 26th of May was, several examples can be given. Neville Chamberlain was not an emotive man. He was not given to hyperbole. He was a quiet man, a self-reflective man. His diary, though, conveys what the mood was like on the 26th of May as news of the Dunkirk evacuation began to reach London. He wrote in his diary this: "Blackest day of all. It is a terrible position for France and ourselves, the most horrible in all our history," underlined. This was, as I say, is not a man driven to great bursts of emotion, but his feelings in this diary were raw. He could see the chasm opening before Britain. With its army trapped at Dunkirk and France left in agony, there seemed nothing and no one left to stop the Nazi onslaught. It wasn't merely politicians who felt the strain. This man, Field Marshal Edmund Ironside, VC, was the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He'd been tasked with planning the British campaign in 1940, and he had been completely overwhelmed by the speed of the German assault. Walking up the stairs at the end of a long day, close to exhaustion, he turned and commented sadly to Anthony Eden, "This is the end of the British Empire." Ironside was no coward. He had a VC, a Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry it is possible to earn in the British military. He'd won it for tremendous courage in the First World War. He was a man who'd travelled to France earlier in the campaign to try and instill some fight into the broken French generals. And as Ironside stood 6'5", he towered over a broken French general slumped in a chair and had lifted him by the lapels out of his chair and shook him, urging him to fight for France. Ironside was no coward. He was no defeatist. Yet even he felt that the British Empire was broken on the 26th of May. And if a man so brave as he could feel that, you can imagine the overall mood. And something of the public mood also reflected this tension. Unusually for Britain, a decision was made to call for a national day of prayer. It was a Sunday on the 26th of May. The United Churches of the British Isles opened their doors to worshippers to join, to pray for the deliverance, not merely of the British Army, but of Europe. And Britain was not an especially religious nation. It was not driven to great displays of religiosity. But on the 26th of May, the queues stretched out of the churches. The public, though only beginning to realize the scale of the disaster, felt the pressure and knew the danger was there. To add to the mood on the 26th of May, it began to rain, breaking several weeks of brilliant sunshine which had shone over the fields of France as the Germans advanced. But on the 26th of May, it was a grey, wet and cool day, and the crowds were forced to queue out of the door, as you can see here at Westminster Abbey, waiting their chance to join the congregation and offer their prayers. And at this stage, it seemed that prayer was all that was left for the British Army and the British Empire. This was the darkest hour. Amidst all this, Lord Halifax began what we now term his Italian Gambit. Lord Halifax was Churchill's foreign minister. He had strong international contacts through the British Foreign Office, a web of international contacts, if you will. And around about the 25th of May, he began to explore one. And it pertained to the man on the right of your picture, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, a fascist, an ally of Nazi Germany. Indeed, Italy was allied to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan through the so-called Pact of Steel, signed in the late 1930s. The Pact of Steel was actually a defensive alliance designed to bring all three powers into war if one was attacked. And so Italy had remained neutral at the outbreak of the Second World War, awaiting events effectively. As it became more and more clear that Germany was crushing France and was indeed, it was possible it was going to crush Britain, Benito Mussolini began to see an opportunity, and he let it be known to the British and the French that he was seriously considering entering the war on Germany's side. This would be a greater blow to the Allied hopes. The addition of a new, comparatively powerful Mediterranean power in the form of Italy, adding its fleet, its air force, and its armies to Nazi Germany, would perhaps tip France over the edge. And remember, on the 26th of May, France is still fighting, although it is desperately close to defeat. The Italians let the British know that this was a possibility and essentially asked the British what will you give us in return for staying neutral? And what Italy wanted more than anything else was Malta, Gibraltar, and perhaps access to the Suez Canal, Mediterranean holdings at the time held by Britain. Halifax brought this news to Churchill and asked Churchill, what would the British be willing to give up to keep the Italians neutral? A war cabinet discussion followed, and Churchill let it be known that he was not immune to the idea of bribing the Italians to stay out of the war, but no more than that. Halifax took this information and took it much further. Rather than simply discussing with the Italians what they might want to remain neutral, instead Halifax opened a line of communication with the Italian foreign minister in London, a man called Bastianini, in which he inquired of Bastianini whether Mussolini, who is of course a neutral at this stage, would be willing to act as an honest broker, as a peace broker, to carry out negotiations between Britain and Germany. Now, this is not what Churchill had told Halifax to do. Halifax was doing this under his own initiative. In this, Halifax greatly overestimated the influence of Mussolini, drawing on his past experience of 1938, where Mussolini seemed to have played an important role at Munich. Halifax thought that Mussolini might play an important role in 1940, but crucially, he was doing this without Churchill's knowledge and without Churchill's approval. Why did Halifax open this line of communication, and what did he intend? We have to piece the evidential record together from Halifax's heavily edited papers, plus the letters, notes, and diaries of contemporaries. Halifax did not believe the war was winnable. He would describe himself as a realist. He thought that it was romantic nonsense to continue a fight against Nazi Germany when the odds seemed so heavily weighed against British survival. And Halifax's attitude was not necessarily defeatist, but it was one that he believed is the only approach that could save Britain from the destruction that Germany had already visited on Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and was visiting upon France. Halifax did not necessarily regard this as an abject surrender, but instead saw it as a way of extracting Britain from a disastrous position with its cities unbombed and its shores unoccupied. But he was doing it without Churchill's say-so. Why could Halifax do this? It was because Halifax was still an extremely strong political player in May 1940. Churchill was not yet fully popular with his own Conservative Party. Halifax was. Churchill was not entirely popular with the king. Halifax was. Halifax had immense power at the higher end of the political spectrum. And although Churchill was very popular with the public in those disastrous days of May 1940, the real power plays were in the halls of Whitehall. And so Halifax secretly opened negotiations with the Italians with a view to negotiating a British peace deal with Adolf Hitler, which, although Halifax had ambitions that it would be moderate, was almost certain to amount to little more than a surrender. And having learned from the Italians that they were moderately interested in the proposal, Halifax began a duel with Winston Churchill over the 48 hours between the 26th of May, the blackest day of all, of course, in Chamberlain's view, and the 28th of May. And this duel would decide the fate of Britain and, by extension, the world as it faced Nazi Germany. Having learned that the Italians were willing to negotiate, though they were rather vague about what it would cost Britain, Halifax brought this to the War Cabinet meeting. So often in films, literature, and art, this meeting is portrayed as taking place in a bunker. It didn't. It actually took place in the Cabinet meeting room in number 10 Downing Street, the home of British Prime Ministers. Just 5 men and a minute taker at this meeting. So very, very small number of men in this grand Georgian meeting room where the only sound at certain times was the ticking of an ornate clock of the 1700s. And here, Halifax and Churchill would fight a duel across the table. Halifax's proposal to Churchill was that, or comment to Churchill was, would Churchill accept peace at any cost if it saved Britain? That's a dangerous question. Churchill wanted to save Britain, but he also recognized he needed to try and save Europe as well. Halifax tried to pin Churchill on this point, and Churchill initially felt himself unable to resist Halifax's approach. Remember, Halifax is a master diplomat. He's extremely careful with his words. He's very convincing. He's a superb orator. We're around a cabinet table, not necessarily for the public. And of course, he's dealing with Chamberlain, also a friend of Halifax, and two inexperienced politicians, Attlee and Greenwood. And Halifax's words were seductive in some ways. They did get across the fact that Britain was in dire danger and that there was a possibility of exiting this situation with British cities unbombed and Britain itself unoccupied. Halifax pressed and pressed Churchill and used clever words to try and lure Churchill into a trap, to try and confuse the matter about the difference between bribing the Italians to stay out of war and contacting the Italians to negotiate a peace. Churchill didn't fall into that trap, but he felt he was too politically weak to tell Halifax outright that this would not be considered. And so instead, although he urged that the war would continue and commented, in fact, that negotiations with Italy would lead to a slippery slope, he was certain, for example, that the Italians would publicize the opening of negotiations and it would humiliate Britain and indeed humiliate the empire. But he could not forbid Halifax directly on the 26th or 27th of May from carrying out discussions, at least. In the fraught, carefully worded battle that was occurring in the cabinet room, a crucial ally assisted Churchill, and that was Chamberlain, of course, a former enemy. But Chamberlain was not sure that Hitler could be trusted. Churchill was certain Hitler could not be trusted, and Chamberlain inclined towards that view. Of course, Chamberlain had been betrayed by Hitler in 1939, and Chamberlain agreed with Churchill that any negotiations with the Italians would be a revelation of British weakness and would certain to end in betrayal. It would be publicly made public and the Germans would see it as a coup. But Churchill still wasn't quite strong enough to tell Halifax to back off and to end this policy. While the British soldiers were being evacuated under heavy bombing, while the nation prayed, the fate of the nation then was being decided by 5 men in the cabinet room in number 10 Downing Street. The tension was so great that as the meeting broke up and Churchill departed for dinner, a man with a famous appetite confessed that he simply couldn't eat a thing. He felt physically sick. He could see the dangers ongoing in his negotiations with Halifax. And Halifax was a man Churchill found difficult to deal with at this stage. He couldn't simply dismiss him. Halifax was too strong. And indeed, Halifax suggested that if Churchill strongly opposed the Italian option, then he would resign from the War Cabinet. Remember, the War Cabinet was only formed on the 10th of May. It's barely 2 weeks old. And if Halifax resigned from the cabinet, it would send a shockwave through the Conservative Party, which at this stage was by no means fully united behind their new Prime Minister, Churchill. It was a very real threat. It could bring down Churchill's infant government. And so Churchill had to tread desperately carefully around Halifax, even though he strongly believed that Halifax was in the wrong. And although Greenwood and Attlee both supported Churchill, they were relative political lightweights. It was only Chamberlain's support, one, of course, through the friendship, that was able to see Halifax off in the opening days. Churchill worried, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. News from Dunkirk was promising, but much yet had to be done. But he was about to make what some have called his coup. Churchill's negotiations were ongoing with the War Cabinet, a 5-man cabinet, including Churchill himself. But there was also an organisation called the Outer Cabinet, which numbered, depending on how one calculates it, between 20 and 30 cabinet ministers who had smaller cabinet posts, some of which were not directly involved in the war effort. They met separately. On the 28th of May, Churchill decided to attend, or call together, I should say, a meeting of the Outer Cabinet to address them. What happened next was a turning point. There's some question about the extent to which Churchill had prepared this speech, and it's somewhat suggested he actually gave it ad hoc, but regardless, his words, and these are an annotated version of his speech, were incredibly powerful. He approached the Outer Cabinet, generally younger ministers, junior ministers, men in their 40s and 50s, who had smaller government posts, and he said this to them. He said, "I've thought carefully in these last days whether it was part of my duty to consider entering into negotiations with that man." Of course, that is Hitler. But, reflecting further, we should become a slave state and Hitler's puppet. I'm convinced that every man of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. And here Churchill was speaking from the heart, but he couldn't be sure that his Outer Cabinet felt the same way, despite the confidence of his words. And he ended with a remarkably strong statement for a politician. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. Incredibly warlike language to use to a British political meeting in 1940. It could have backfired. It could have gone horribly wrong. Remember, Churchill had a reputation as a wild man, as an adventurer, as a warmonger. But instead, he turned those skills to his strength. And facing the outer cabinet of younger men, many of whom, in fact, had served in the First World War, and giving this impassioned speech, it must have been a moment of tension as Churchill awaited to see the reaction. But the reaction he got was unanimous. Far from greeting it with lukewarm applause or perhaps a shuffling of papers, instead it was met with a rapturous reception by the outer cabinet, and the normally restrained members of the government instead approached Churchill, slapping him on the shoulder, slapping him on the back, agreeing wholeheartedly that they as individuals would rather fight to the death than ever surrender to Adolf Hitler. It was a revelation to Churchill about the feeling within his own political party. The feeling that they wished to go on fighting chimed, of course, perfectly with his own outlook. And it showed to him that Halifax perhaps did not have the same amount of power as Halifax himself thought that he did. Infused with this new enthusiasm, full in the knowledge that the political group now supports him, that the outer cabinet was 100% behind him, Churchill went back into the meeting on the 28th with the war cabinet. And he told Halifax in no uncertain terms that there would be no negotiations with the Italians. They would not be bribed, and there would be no use opening negotiations with the Germans through Benito Mussolini. As Churchill summarized, nations that surrendered tamely were lost, but those who went down fighting would rise again. Halifax, who himself was becoming tired of this duel, despite his own superb oratory and political machinations, Halifax was becoming worn down by Churchill's determination. Seeing Churchill suddenly imbued with a surge of energy, a new surge of life, Halifax could face him no more. And this surge of energy Churchill gained from this speech can't be underestimated. It was as if a new man had entered the cabinet room. Chamberlain, who was a somewhat religious man, but by no means a spiritualist, even commented that Churchill seemed to be outlined in a white glow. Such was his energy, having given the speech to the outer cabinet. Halifax's attempt, therefore, to bring Britain out of the war was defeated. Britain would go on fighting, no matter the cost, no matter the dangers. And this set Britain on a course that would, of course, ensure that Europe did not fall entirely into the darkness of Nazi tyranny. It was a crucial moment. Had Halifax overwhelmed Churchill, had forced him into a corner, had outmaneuvered him, negotiations would have been opened with the Italians, and the consequences would have been just as Churchill feared: disaster, humiliation, shame, and ultimately, most likely, an abject surrender to Nazi Germany. With Halifax defeated, Churchill's energy and determination grew. And just as Halifax was seen off on the 28th of May, so the German attempts to crush the Dunkirk perimeter began to falter as the month wore on. Churchill had believed he might lift 45,000 troops from the Dunkirk beaches. In reality, he lifted over 330,000 British, French, and Belgian troops. And although they were shorn of all their equipment, these were trained fighting men. Weapons could be put back into their hands. They could be reorganized. They could be re-prepared. And so almost 10 times the number of soldiers that Churchill had hoped in his wildest dreams to evacuate had been evacuated and brought back to British shores. And at the end of the Dunkirk evacuation on the 4th of June, Churchill gave one of his most celebrated and most powerful and most important speeches to Parliament initially, and then addressed to the nation. It's a long speech. You can find the recorded version of it on the internet. But the point that perhaps most important, the point that ended this and drove this point home, is what we know now as the Never Surrender speech, in which he stated bluntly, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And this was a sea change, of course. Remember, just a week earlier, Churchill had been forced to make a deal with Halifax on the 26th and 27th. He couldn't reject it entirely, but just a week later, Churchill was now in such a strong position that he could bring his defiance to the British public, and the public responded with tremendous enthusiasm. Volunteers for the Home Guard or the local defence volunteers, older men or men with injuries and physical ailments unable to serve in the regular army, rocketed during this period. Indeed, so many men came forward that the authorities simply could not take them all and had to send a large number of them home. The evacuated army from Dunkirk was reorganised as best it could, and the British prepared for the battle to come. The reaction was crucial, and here we have a newspaper headline from the Daily Mirror. Daily Mirror was then, and indeed still is now, a very left-wing newspaper and had been a tremendous critic of Winston Churchill in the 1920s and 1930s, portraying him as an adventurer and a warmonger. But even they were swung by the power of his oratory and the determination to resist Nazi Germany, placing it on their front page, as did almost every other major national newspaper on that day and the day after. It caught a mood that Britain would fight on no matter the cost. Better to die fighting or choking in one's own blood, as Churchill said to the Outer Cabinet, than give in to the darkness of Nazi tyranny. And Churchill understood something, of course, that Halifax did not. That was the fact that Hitler could not be negotiated with. Hitler was a man who'd done nothing but violate peace treaties, territorial treaties, a man who'd happily turn on his own political party if it suited him, a ruthless man, a tiger, as Winston Churchill called him. And you cannot negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. Halifax never realized this. He still saw to the very end that the Germans were perhaps somebody who could be negotiated with, when in fact what they were was a revolutionary movement that would not stop, that was sweeping away the old order of Europe, and had it been allowed to continue unchecked, may have well swept away the order of the world. But it was not to be. Churchill defeated Halifax's challenge, and then he rallied the nation around him. It would need more than just oratory, though, to ensure victory in 1940. The Battle of France would come to an end in June 1940, and France surrendered to occupation. The Battle of Britain would begin that month, and its outcome would determine the fate of the British Isles in the skies. But that's perhaps a talk for another time. For now, I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you would like to connect with me directly through social media, you can do so through my Twitter handle, which is historian1914. Otherwise, I'm very much looking to your questions, and I hope to provide satisfactory answers to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for sending in some really interesting questions. And I'm going to do, in the limited time we have, I'm going to do my absolute best to try and get through as many of them as possible. But if I've missed your personal question out and you'd like to follow up, you do have my Twitter details, or feel free to look up my details on Google and drop me an email to my university account, and I'll do my best to get back to you. So the first question I have in front of me is a book review question, which is about Eric Larson's book, The Splendid and the Vile, which came out just a few years ago, and is essentially a book, for those of you who don't know, a book about the first year of Churchill's prime ministership. It's a weighty tome, over 700 pages long, but that's my opinion on it. And I have to say, I think it's an excellent book. Considering its density, it reads almost like a novel. It's heavily based on the reminiscences of Churchill's youngest daughter, Mary, and his personal secretary, John Colville, who provide a very vivid account of Churchill's first year. It's more than just about Churchill as well. It's also about the Blitz. It's about the spirit in Britain in 1940 and into 1941, and that remarkable period of time when Britain, and of course supported by the Empire, stood alone. I think it's a very, very good book. It's well researched. It's extremely readable. And if you've not read it and you would like a flavor for what 1940 and 41 were like in Britain, I highly recommend it. It's an excellent read. I read it in lockdown, and it certainly brightened my COVID-enforced lockdown, I can assure you. The second question is, what were the main factors in the rapid British and French collapse in the spring of 1940? And could the Germans have wiped out the British at Dunkirk if they'd been more aggressive? This is almost deserves its own lecture. The Battle of France in 1940 is what one French author of the time, and indeed a soldier, referred to as a strange defeat. in many ways, it seemed an unlikely defeat. Britain and France seemed to have a preponderance of force. They prepared for a long war and so forth. Several factors, to give you a very brief answer, explain their rapid defeat. One was the German advance through the Ardennes. The British and the French anticipated an advance into Belgium, but they were drawn in by a feint, and then they were broken on the so-called hinge at the Ardennes, and the Germans raced through and encircled them. The French military had manifold problems that stretched right back to the 1920s. It was not used to, or certainly had no real ability to fight a rapidly moving campaign. The British army was very closely tied to the French army as well. It had to essentially follow its lead. And the breakdown of command and communications as the Germans broke through at such speed just completely wrong-footed the Allies. That's the simple reason. Once the Germans had broken through, the Allies could never regain their balance. And of course, the Germans rushed to the Channel, cut off the bulk of those Allied forces in Belgium and left them in a very vulnerable position. There's a lot more to it than that, of course, but that deserves its own talk. Could the Germans have wiped out the British at Dunkirk? Absolutely. In fact, one of the great mistakes the Germans made was having a relatively slow army, ground troops advance, because Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy the British on the beaches and destroy the evacuation fleet. Of course, in this, he was wrong. And although it did inflict a great deal of damage and a great deal of hardship, it must be added, on the evacuating troops, it did not destroy them. Hitler himself also ordered the Germans briefly to pause outside Dunkirk. This is sometimes seen as a fatal mistake. It certainly delayed the Germans for 48 hours, but there were actually some reasons for him doing this. The Germans were outrunning their supply lines and so forth. But if the Germans had pressed harder into Dunkirk, they certainly could have destroyed the British army, driving it into the sea, quite literally, and a missed opportunity for the Germans in some ways, but also owing something to the way that the Nazi command worked. Goering, one of Hitler's favorites in 1940, promised he could do it with his air force alone. Hitler thought that would save the German army casualties, and so he listened to Goering. Question 3, interested in Churchill's time in India. Could you briefly talk about his role in India? Yes, I can. So although Churchill was a great imperialist and had traveled around substantial parts of the empire, he spent a relatively limited amount of time in India itself. He actually did it as a young man when he was a young soldier, a young officer in the British cavalry in the early 1890s. And this was when his unit was stationed in India. And like many of his contemporaries who spent time in India, Churchill never fell in love with the country. He never became a British Indian or an Anglo-Indian, as they were known at the time. He actually found life in India a little bit slow for him. The heat, of course, slowed him down. It made it difficult for him to get about. His unit didn't see much action at this time. And he spent most of his time in India actually reading. And it was during this period that he really expanded his own reading. He really developed an intense love of historical literature and history in general. But his actual time in India, I wouldn't describe it as unhappy, but it did not leave a lasting love of the country on him, unlike it left on some of his contemporaries. Nevertheless, he still regarded India as a fundamental part of the British Empire and admired its romanticism, if not necessarily the nation itself. And it's curious why he never fell in love with India. He developed a great deal of affection for South Africa, for example, later in the war, later in his career, but not India. But nevertheless, he still regarded it as essential to the British Empire, which is why he opposed Halifax over the gradual moves towards Indian independence in the 1930s. Question 4 is a question about Chamberlain. Chamberlain has been accused of caving to Hitler based upon Hitler's promises to be nice, and therefore was personally responsible for the loss of the Sudetenland as a result. True or oversimplification? What do you think? I'm going to play a typical historian's card here and say it's complicated. Chamberlain never understood Hitler, at least not during the years of peace. Hitler, on the other hand, understood Chamberlain. Whereas Chamberlain still saw Hitler as an uncouth and unsophisticated politician, but still a politician of the type he could deal with, Hitler recognized Chamberlain's old-fashioned nature, dismissing him at various times as the old umbrella or even the old worm when he was in one of his darker moods. And it was this failure to understand the nature of Nazism and the nature of Adolf Hitler himself, a treacherous, dark individual who would go to any length to achieve what he wished, that undermined Chamberlain. He just could not read this man. Now, Chamberlain was not unique in this inability to read Hitler. Almost all of the British cabinet at the time suffered from the same problem. And not merely the British cabinet, the French cabinet as well also regarded Adolf Hitler as somebody who could be dealt with. And so to lay it all at Chamberlain's feet is perhaps overly harsh. Nevertheless, Chamberlain was in many ways the true architect of appeasement. It was built on earlier policies from previous prime ministers, but it was Chamberlain who embraced it fully. And one of the things with Chamberlain that makes it difficult to sympathize with him is his personal writings at the time don't betray any real understanding of Adolf Hitler. Even as late as September 1939, as Germany invaded Poland, Chamberlain desperately sought a way out of the inevitable armed conflict that had to be fought. Can it all be laid at Chamberlain's feet? No, because this was part of a British establishment approach. And this appeasement really was felt to have the moral high ground. There were few, apart from Churchill, who argued against it. But Chamberlain drove it forward, even as it was becoming increasingly untenable through 1938. And for that, he must take a portion of the blame. Question 5, how historically accurate are the movies Dunkirk and Darkest Hour? I was rather hoping someone would ask about Darkest Hour. Dunkirk is certainly thematic. Yes, there's some errors in there. There's some nods towards cinematic reality. For example, how long the Spitfires can stay in action and how much ammunition that they have. They didn't actually carry that much ammunition. There's also one quirk, which is the fact that the director, Christopher Nolan, chose to use as little CGI as possible actually means there's far fewer ships, British ships, operating around Dunkirk than there were historically. So it actually gives you an impression there weren't that many ships. In fact, there was an awful lot. It also makes the air raids that come in look relatively small scale, you know, a handful of German Stukas here and there, when in fact there were waves of not only Stukas, but also twin-engine German bombers like Ju-88s striking as well. In terms though of its atmosphere and particularly its portrayal of dogfights, it's extremely good, using, of course, actual aircraft moving in maneuvers that could be carried out. It's beautifully made. I actually really enjoy the film. So from a personal perspective, it's one of my favorites. And I think the sound design is immense. Darkest Hour, though, is a film I have some difficulties with, even though it's an Oscar winner. Number of problems. One, I think it's very simplistic in its portrayal of Chamberlain. Chamberlain's just cast as a villain, and in fact, his role in 1940 was actually much more of an ally to Churchill than it was to Halifax. There's certain cinematic nods, such as they meet in the bunker rather than the cabinet rooms. But my biggest complaint is that they portray Churchill almost as a caricature of Churchill. And yes, Gary Oldman plays him brilliantly, but it's almost a sort of weird memory of Churchill rather than how he was. There's also two howling historical accuracies that really get under my skin. One is he meets the king and they're dining together, as they did frequently throughout the war, and Winston Churchill feeds some food from the king's table to a dog underneath it. Now, I would be shouted at if I did that in my parents' house. Imagine doing it in front of the King of England in 1940. Absolutely not. And the second thing is they remove the outer cabinet speech entirely. Instead of speaking to the outer cabinet, he instead travels through the London tube and speaks to various Londoners and becomes convinced he has to fight on from there, which is completely inaccurate. Churchill may never have caught a tube in his entire life. And it was a very silly decision, in my opinion, that took away some of the drama, in fact, of that great outer cabinet speech and how it rallied him. But I'm not a great fan of Darkest Hour, I have to say, but I really enjoyed Dunkirk. Question, deja vu, Hitler and Putin, Belgium, Ukraine, Western appeasement. Well, one thing I will say about the current war in Ukraine is Churchill would have instantly recognized the type of man that Vladimir Putin and those surrounding him were. I think he'd have seen through Putin far quicker than a number of politicians in Britain have done. And I'm absolutely certain that he would have recognized the type of expansionism that Russia was pursuing. Now, at times, although I haven't mentioned them in my talk, Churchill was very anti-Soviet Russia. In fact, in the 1920s, he was intensely anti-Soviet Russia, only changing to the Nazis in the 30s as he saw them as a more imminent threat. And there's certainly some historical parallels here. And the argument that Ukraine should have simply been left alone and indeed left to be overrun by the Russians because that's the more realistic move, has strong echoes of appeasement, and Churchill would certainly have rejected those. So we can see some interesting historical parallels there. Question 7, was the age of the outer cabinet the key to the reception of Churchill's message? Yes, certainly that played a factor, because younger politicians, we can paint with a broad brush here, but in general, younger politicians were drawn more closely to Churchill, were more against appeasement than their older contemporaries. And that's quite interesting, because a number of the younger men, including some outer cabinet men, had actually fought in the First World War. And you might think that that experience in the First World War would have put them off future wars, when in actual fact, it perhaps made them more resolved to face down the German menace once again, just as they had done 20 years earlier. It's significant that Chamberlain and Halifax had seen no military action, or that had no military careers whatsoever. And indeed, when one looks at the appeasers in a more general sense in the 1930s, none of them had served in the First World War, whereas a number of the most devout anti-appeasers had seen action in that conflict, and perhaps it gave them a different perspective. The outer cabinet was younger. It was also somewhat more dynamic. It wasn't quite so tied up with the governments of the mid-1930s, which had been excruciatingly pro-appeasement. And so that played a role as well. Can you draw parallels between Churchill and Zelensky? Absolutely. There's two I'd immediately draw upon. The first is Zelensky's absolute defiance, especially in the early part of the invasion, when many in the Western media were predicting that this war would be over in 48 hours or 72 hours at a push. And the general expectation, certainly in Britain, was that this war was done almost the moment the Russians crossed the border. And Zelensky's defiance in refusing to surrender, refusing to acknowledge defeat, and promising to fight on has intense Churchillian echoes. He's this very strong orator, not only in to Ukrainians, but also to an international audience. And when he addressed the British Houses of Parliament relatively soon after the outbreak of war via video link, he directly cited Winston Churchill and echoed the famous Never Surrender speech. And his embodiment of a will to resist is extremely important, especially in a country like Ukraine, which has not always been blessed with the strongest or the most honest or the most reliable politicians. He infuses national spirit with his determination, and there's very, very strong parallels there. And it reminds us too of the importance of a charismatic, determined, patriotic leader in times of war. So there's very, very strong parallels there. It's interesting too that graffiti of Winston Churchill appeared in Kyiv during the early days of the invasion, placing him alongside Zelensky. And I think that shows a really interesting echo that the memory of Churchill was being called upon in 2022, over 80 years later, and in a completely different nation. I think that's the power of Churchill's leadership. Question 9, why did Halifax approach Italy instead of the United States to enter the war? It was because Italy was allied to Nazi Germany through the Pact of Steel. And so it was felt that the Italians had the ear of the Germans. Halifax also had some experience of working with Mussolini. That was at the Munich conference in late 1938, where Mussolini had portrayed himself as an honest broker between the British and the French, and the Germans on the other side. So Halifax knew something about how Mussolini worked. He believed Mussolini had influence over Hitler. And that was a crucial difference, because Hitler and Roosevelt had no relationship to speak of, and Halifax didn't believe that Roosevelt would be in a position to do any kind of negotiation with Hitler. He didn't think Hitler would be interested, didn't think Hitler would listen. Mussolini, on the other hand, he believed he did. In actuality, Mussolini had very little influence over Hitler, if any at all, and Halifax was wrong, but he saw this as the most likely way to negotiate a way out of the war. So that's why he chose Italy, the alliance and his belief Mussolini had genuine influence over Hitler. Question 10, did Churchill have a speechwriter? If yes, who was it? No, he did not. He wrote his own speeches, frequently corrected them, would sometimes correct them on the fly. So he'd be midway through a speech and he'd change the wording. We can see this because some of his papers are preserved. Well, in fact, a very large number of his papers are preserved, and it's fascinating to see his speeches complete with crossings out, the original copies of his speeches with words crossed out and new words inserted, that sometimes he would do mid-flow, especially when he was younger. As he got older, he became more confident with his language. And he was always a wonderful wordsmith. He became more confident with it. Of course, he was an extremely successful author in his own right as well. So it was quite easy to go from writing books to giving speeches. So he wrote virtually all of his own speeches, and certainly all of his wartime speeches, were his own handiwork. And not only, therefore, did he have wonderful delivery, but he also had wonderful speech writing skills. He truly was a man of very, very many talents. Question 11 is, what happened at Calais during the Dunkirk evacuation? And this is a story of heroism, because the Germans wanted to take Calais. Calais was actually a better port for the British evacuation. It was a bigger port, it had more facilities. The Germans zoomed in on Calais very early in the breakthrough. Britain sent emergency reinforcements to Calais, and Calais was ordered to defend itself to the last bullet, full in the knowledge, of course, that there'll be no evacuation, that they were fighting to distract the Germans and allow the bulk of the army to get to Dunkirk. Calais was overrun. Ultimately, the defenders there forced into ever-decreasing circles until their perimeter collapsed, and they were forced to surrender along with their wounded. Their heroism, though, their delaying of the German move from Calais to Dunkirk was crucial, as was the casualties they inflicted upon the Germans. And there's an argument that the determined defense, the dogged defense at Calais, and the damage it inflicted on the Germans discouraged the Germans from pushing too hard at Dunkirk, and perhaps made Hitler a little more willing to listen to Goering when he said he could do it to aircraft alone. So the loss of the Calais garrison after a very heroic defense actually played a big role in saving the troops at Dunkirk. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid completes our Q&A. If I've missed anything, or if you've got anything you'd like to follow up upon, as I say, do get in touch with me via Twitter or drop me a line. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention and for your excellent questions. And I hope to see you again on One Day University in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.